And then you walk away from medicine. You go into. So were you doing medicine specific consulting?
So I was recruited to do that because McKinsey, and I'm sure this is true of like Bain and BCG, which are kind of the other two really big management consulting firms. They recruit about a third of their consultants who, out of sort of what we call non-typical or atypical rather backgrounds. So people who have PhDs or JDs or MDs, but who didn't go to business school. And then so they send you off to do business school that summer. They do this thing called a mini MBA, which was, I mean, it was like being a kid in a candy store again, because I got to go spend a whole summer in school again, learning finance, like learning all of these things that, you know, for some people might seem kind of dry, but when you're like just dying to get back into numbers, I was like, oh my God, like, you know, I remember the first time we learned what was called the efficient frontier, which is basically this differential equation that describes, you know, an investment philosophy. I was like, I can't believe I'm doing this again. I can't believe it. So then we show up for orientation. I'm in San Francisco at this time. That was the other thing. I wanted to get back to California. So I was like, you know, San Francisco, please. So during the first, during orientation week, I was approached by one of the staffers there, and they said, hey, you know, your background looks like you've done a lot of mathematics. I said, yeah. They said, well, you know, we know you're a physician and you're probably here to work on, you know, all the medical teams are going to try to grab you to have you work on some biotech thing or whatever. But we have this banking issue that is very important to some of our clients, and it requires, you know, an ability to do stochastic calculus. Would you be up for doing that? And I was like, of course. And so then, you know, that was basically the beginning, and I never really stopped doing that stuff. So I ended up doing what was called credit risk modeling, which started out around this thing called the Basel II Accord, which was a type of this was a regulation that came out in the mid 2000s that required banks to hold a certain amount of capital against unexpected losses. Right. So banks have a long history of knowing how to hold capital for expected losses, but they don't really know what to do for unexpected losses. And in particular, the problem that was damning was something called asset value correlations. So if you're a bank, you could have 27 lines of business. You do first mortgage, second mortgage, auto, student, credit card, like you name it. And the problem is nobody really understood how those assets correlated. So if your loss rate is X in this, what's the probability that it impacts the loss rate in that?
So where the rubber meets the road is, if I can't make my house payment, I'm probably not making my car payment either.
That's right.
And that's what nobody kind of realized. Everything went down.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So that turned into, as we were in the midst of that,
because the banks used to leverage themselves so much that they could, when the market crashed, they couldn't handle it.
You know, it's it's like literally one of my favorite topics, actually, which I'm sure your listeners don't want to get bored to tears on it. But first of all, the best movie of all the movies that have like tried to explain what's going on, The Big Short by far does the best job, because it actually explains the sequence of events that took this from being just an isolated problem to a systemic problem. Most people miss the subtlety of how this thing ceased to be contained. You know, because technically a housing crisis shouldn't have affected the global economy. So it was these instruments called CDOs that effectively allowed this problem to become enormous. But at the time, the bigger issue was, you know, just a great example of hubris that exists everywhere, right? Which is, one, we don't like looking at data that contradict our point of view. And we're all guilty of this. I'm guilty of this. I find myself doing it, and I actually am now quite amused. I'm so attuned to it now that I'm quite amused. Like if I'm flipping through Twitter, I'll see a story that is completely against how I feel, and I don't want to read it. And then like the next one will be like exactly how I feel. I want to read it. And I'm like, dude, look what you just did, man. You gotta stop, pull back, go, assume you are wrong, and keep going and try to figure out if you're. But so at the banking level, I mean, and we, you know, the canary in the coal mine here. Well, there were many, but in early 2006, mid 2006, when we were trying to do these asset value correlations, one of the biggest problems we had is we only had 10 years of data. The banks only had this data recorded for 10 years. We didn't have losses to model. And I remember saying to the controller at this bank, I'm like, hey man, it's going to be really hard to build you a model of losses when you don't have any historical losses. And he goes, well, that's mortgages. Mortgages can't lose money. Right? So that was, and we can laugh at that now, but at the time, that was not an unreasonable point of view. Yeah. Right? You can't lose money on a first mortgage. Think about it. You got to put 20% down. You want to buy a home for $100,000? You better show up with 20. You better be able to document you have a job. You better do this. You better do that. You better do that. So the bank's only on the hook for 80 on a home that's been legitimately appraised for 100, and you've shown documentation. So you're at least going to pay that thing down to 70, such that worst case scenario, market falls by 10%. House is worth 90. You lose your job. Guess who still gets paid? The bank. They still get their 70. Sure, if you're in the business of creating a second mortgage, you take a little bit more risk. But there's no reason you should have been losing money on first mortgages. And so you fast forward a year.
Well, especially because don't worry about the value of the house, because that's going to go
always
up.
Always going to go up. That's right.
So we're good to go.
Oh, well, that's where, and I remember even when I was in Baltimore, one of my buddies, because, the residents were always looking for a way to make a buck on the side, right? When you're making $34K a year, you gotta come up with. And the only saving grace is you can't spend money. Your clothes is free. You're in scrubs all the time. You're kind of eating for free all the time because I eat off the patient's trays, whatever they didn't finish. I'd go to the nurse's station and eat all this crap. So I didn't actually spend much money. Pens was the only thing I wasted money on. I collect Mont Blancs, and so even through residency, I would still buy these beautiful pens. So yeah, I remember one of my buddies being like, "Dude, we got to start buying houses in Baltimore because they're so cheap, and you can get them with no money down. So you could buy a house for $200,000, put $5,000 down. If that house goes up to 220, you just made 25K. You made 20K on your 5.
We're going all the way.
And no one does the math of what if it goes down to 190? You just lost everything, right? So luckily, I didn't get in on any of those sweetheart deals. Although, if you time them right, there a lot of people did make a lot of money on those deals before the shoe fell. So when things started to become clear, so in early 07, it became clear subprime mortgages were going to be a problem. By August of 07, a very famous, then famous analyst, what's her name? Meredith Whitney, I believe is her name. I think she was at Oppenheimer, called something that at the time seemed crazy. She said Citigroup is going to cut its dividend next month. So for Citigroup, huge, one of the largest banks in the country, to not pay a dividend for Q3 seemed impossible. But she'd done the math. She's like, yeah, there's no way. They're getting crushed on these mortgage-backed securities. And everyone was like, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Sure enough, Q3 comes along, Citi cuts its dividend, Chuck Prince, the CEO of Citi, gets fired. And at that point, it's like, God damn. But again, everybody was still thinking, this is just a subprime problem. It's an inch wide, and yeah, it's a mile deep, but it's an inch wide. Well, in the background, we're working on another problem, which is prime mortgages, that which everybody thinks is totally fine, that which has a historical default ratio of less than 0.5%. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing in the data that was right in front of this bank the whole time, there's a tsunami coming. Your default rate's going to hit 4 or 5%, which, again, that might not sound like a lot. That's 10 times your default rate. It's going to be actually higher than that, as we learned. And your loss given a default is going up much higher. So loss is actually the dot product of probability of default and loss given default. Okay? You guys are my only 2 customers. Probability you default is 50%. The probability you default is 10%. If you default, you will lose 100,000. So it's 10% times 100,000. I expect to lose 10,000 on you. If you default, it's 2,000. So 50% times 2,000, 1,000. So my total expected loss is 11,000. So this is, you do this 88 million times for every account you have. And the model to predict probability default and loss given default are enormous models that each have 50 variables in them. Actually, the PD does, the LGD doesn't. But what people didn't realize is the loss given defaults were skyrocketing. It was like, in fact, again, at the level of just being kind of a math idiot, like that to me was so amazing to watch, right? It was like, holy shit, watch these LGDs go. They're just like blowing up, like, and then you knew once the PD triggered, meaning once the probability of default went, oh, it was going to become a non-linear catastrophe. And it turned out, so Thursday, November 15th, 2007 was kind of the day, like that was the matrix moment. So I had a team, great example. I was able to be a leader for once because I had an amazing team. I had a team in San Francisco of 4 people. I had a team in India of 4 guys. We worked round the clock, 16 hours a day, every day, except Sundays we took off. And we would pass the model back and forth to each other. Amazing. Like it was pure bliss to be working that hard on this problem. And on that day, we basically came up with 4 independent models that all predicted how bad this thing was going to be. And we presented it to the leadership of this bank. And it's really funny. I was a manager. So at McKinsey, you have these levels like analyst, associate, manager, junior partner, partner, director. For a meeting of that stature, meaning you're talking to the entire leadership of the bank, the senior partner would only be the one to predict. I'd be in the corner working the PowerPoint, answering a question if piped up, because there's going to be a technical question. But the senior partner would do all the talking. But on that day, we go into the meeting, and the senior partner says, Peter, you should present this. And I said, are you sure? Because I'm like the 3rd most junior guy in the room here. And he said, yeah, 2 reasons. 1, you're the only one who actually understands how all of these models work. And 2, and this is the funniest thing he said, he goes, 2, because of all of your experience with cancer patients, you're going to be very good at answering hard questions about bad things happening.
Wow.
And I was like, okay. So I stepped in and I did my best to be empathetic and non-judgmental and like just as evidence fact-based as I could. And this is what this says, and this is what this. When you look at the run rate model and the PGD says this and the LGD says this and the vintage model says this, and here. And so finally, like the president of the bank says, how much money are we going to lose? Like she was kind of like, like all good leaders, she's just like, tell me the goddamn answer first. So I said, I had to think on my feet like pretty quickly about a way to put it in terms. So I said, you're going to lose more money in the next 18 months than you've made in the last 10 years. And
see, the Jocko answer to that question, how much money we going to lose, would have been all of it.
That's the difference between you and me on Twitter, right? Like you always have the best answer, like always, because that would be like, hey Jocko, like he just pictured it on Twitter. Hey, like the CEO of like the bank. Hey Jocko, how much money are we going to lose? All of it. Peter, 1 of 3. Well, start with your EBITDA last year. Multiply that by 2 of 3. 3 of 3.
Yeah. Did they listen to you at all?
No.
Yeah. Didn't want to believe that data, huh?
That was impossible. That was impossible to fathom. Years later, because I had by this point left McKinsey, but I stayed in close touch with that team. And I reached back out to that senior partner who, actually, I'm still very close with. I just got a mail from him 2 days ago. I said, hey, man, remember all those models? Yeah. Were we roughly close? And he goes, no, the model's underestimated by a third. I mean, I was like, it seemed like we kept trying to tone the models down because they kept giving us these answers, and we were like, God damn, like there's no way it can be this bad. Yeah. And we were like, oh, let's make this assumption more conservative and let's do this and let's, and in the end it was like, nope, it was actually that bad.
Brutal.